Good day. Last 24 hours, news about the situation in Ukraine on the battlefronts has again been sketchy, but there has been some information trickling through, and it does appear to be again pointing to a deepening crisis for Ukraine in the battles in Donbass, especially. Firstly, there's now reports that the Ukrainians are having to redeploy forces that had been allocated to its front in Zaporozhye region. Now, a couple of weeks ago, there were all kinds of rumors that Ukraine was planning some kind of advance towards the Sea of Azov, towards the Black Sea, intending to slice in two the Russian land bridge to Crimea. More reports have come through since then about the massive defenses that the Russians are supposedly building in this area. Large numbers of tank traps, so-called dragon's teeth, trenches, all that kind of thing, and of the heavy deployments of Russian forces in this area, making it extremely unlikely that a Ukrainian breakthrough to the Sea of Azov and to the Black Sea would be possible. By the way, there's also been a whole string of reports in the British media, especially the Daily Telegraph, about the essentially untenable position for Ukrainian forces in Kherson city, the city on the right bank of the Dnieper, which the Russians evacuated a few weeks ago. I've discussed this several times. I don't want to go over this again, but it's clear that with the Russians just a kilometer away from Kherson city on the east bank of the Dnieper, they're able to bring down heavy volumes of artillery fire on Ukrainian forces in Kherson city. The result is that every attempt by the Ukrainians to re-establish electrical supplies and water supplies to the city have been impossible. There was a rather sad report in the Daily Telegraph about evacuations of more Ukrainian civilians from Kherson city. These were people who chose to stay in Kherson city when the Russians were also trying to evacuate the civilian population some weeks ago. These were people who are presumably loyal to Ukraine. They're finding that they have to be evacuated as well because of the heavy Russian artillery fire and the inability of Ukraine to protect them and to provide them with essential utilities, or even, as I understand it, food supplies. Now, I mention all of this simply because the very heavy Russian artillery fire on Kherson city and on all that surrounding area again points to the very heavy concentrations of Russian forces in eastern Kherson region and in adjoining Zaporozhye region. It looks extremely unlikely now that a Ukrainian offensive in this area is for the moment possible. So perhaps it is logical that Ukraine is now withdrawing forces from Zaporozhye region and is redeploying them to Bakhmut. And there's also now reports that because of a general ammunition crisis, something which Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has been talking about for months, the fact that Ukraine is no longer able to access large amounts of 155 millimeter shells from the United States because supplies of those shells have become so severely depleted. And despite the fact that 152 millimeter shells, Soviet caliber shells of the kind used by Ukraine's Soviet era artillery, have also been depleted. They were also depleted earlier in the war, and apparently attempts to restart production and to transfer to Ukraine stocks of these shells from Eastern Europe and the Middle East have become increasingly problematic because of this growing shell shortage, Ukraine is also having to redeploy artillery from the Zaporozhye region to try and hold the line in Bakhmut, and also, and importantly, in northern Donbass and southern Kharkiv region. The area around Svatovo and Kremena, these two towns which Ukraine has been trying to capture ever since the Kharkiv counteroffensive back in September, and also in and around Krasny Liman, or Liman, this town formerly occupied by the Russians, which the Ukrainians also were able to capture at the tail end of their counteroffensive. Apparently, Ukrainian forces in this area are now also running very short of artillery, very short of ammunition, and they're having to pull in artillery from other areas to try to reinforce their positions in this area in the face of what are now looking to be increasingly purposeful Russian counterattacks. So we have a situation where Ukraine is now having to strip other fronts, notably the Zaporozhye front, to hold its positions, or try to hold its positions around Bakhmut and in this area of northern Donbass and southern Kharkiv region. In the meantime, we are getting more reports of Russian advances. Now, this is extremely difficult to try to track because the Russians are very, very careful at the moment about reporting information about these advances. But I've heard reports that a place called Toretsk near Bakhmut, a Ukrainian controlled town near Bakhmut, has also been the subject of some kind of a Russian attack. I even saw a report which suggested the Ukrainians had been defeated there. I don't know what that means. I don't know whether that means that the Russians have actually captured this place. I doubt it actually. But anyway, there's clearly been fighting of some kind around there, and it looks as if the Ukrainians are getting the worst of it. And there's also reports further south that a place called Vodyane, which is another village in that area near Donetsk, leading to Avdiivka, the major fortified position held by Ukraine near Donetsk, that this is now coming under severe pressure and that the Russian forces are gradually coming close to capturing this place as well. And by the way, there still appears to be fighting in Marinka, the village or small town. It's about 10,000 people before the war. And again, there's been reports that the Russians are now gradually pushing the remaining Ukrainian forces out of the outskirts of this town, and that the entire town will soon be under full Russian control, creating another crack in these Ukrainian defense lines around Donetsk city. Or perhaps, let's not call them defense lines, maybe they were siege lines around Donetsk city. By the way, and in spite of the ammunition shortage, I've also heard reports that Ukraine has launched more artillery strikes on Donetsk city. This is perhaps partly a reflection of Ukraine's desire to try and continue to show that it is able to continue fighting in some form. So we've had all of those reports pouring in. Now, yesterday, rather the day before yesterday, I discussed Ursula von der Leyen's comment that 100,000 Ukrainian officers had been killed over the course of the war. That comment was then edited out of the published versions of Ursula von der Leyen's speech. I understand that the European officials have not actually retracted the comment, but they're now saying that this was simply Ursula von der Leyen's estimate of Ukrainian losses. Well, maybe so, but that is not what she said in her comment. She didn't say that Ukraine had lost an estimated 100,000 officers. She just said that Ukraine had lost 100,000 officers killed. I mean, I'm not in a position to judge this one way or the other, but as I said previously, that does seem to conform with estimates of Ukrainian losses, which have been coming from various sources, including, of course, from Russian sources. Anyway, Ukraine took this extremely badly. A Ukrainian official, Yuri Podolyak, has now said that Ukraine has suffered losses killed in action of 13 to 14,000 men since February. I don't think anybody takes that number seriously, but, well, I report it. It seems that Ursula von der Leyen's estimate, if you like to call it that, has been circulating, buzzing around in Ukraine itself and amongst Ukrainian soldiers, and it's causing some degree of dismay amongst those soldiers, probably because it corresponds with their own experience. Now, there's been some very interesting discussions about what Ukrainian losses, dead in action, killed in action, 100,000 men, might mean to the Ukrainian military. And Larry Johnson, former CIA analyst, one of the most perceptive and insightful commentators about the war in Ukraine, he's pointed out that if 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed, then on the usually accepted ratio that there's 4 wounded for every one soldier killed, then that would mean that Ukraine's total combat losses since the start of the war have been around 500,000. Well, that's an estimate. That is an estimate. But then Larry Johnson has a background as a CIA analyst. It's the sort of thing that he is trained and experienced in doing. So I think we should take his estimate extremely seriously. And Larry Johnson points out that if this estimate is true, then on the assumption that Ukraine had total armed forces of around 1 million men at one time, I mean, this is total armed forces, soldiers, air force, people in the reserves, whatever, then something like half the Ukrainian military have been casualties of one form or another over the course of this war. Now, to stress again, that does not mean that Ukraine has lost 500,000 men, because, of course, many of those wounded will have been lightly wounded and will have been able to return to the battle. So it doesn't mean that. It does perhaps give us some idea, if this estimate is correct, about the scale of the suffering that Ukrainian soldiers have faced over the course of this war. And for what it's worth, I think this is probably correct. It means that every Ukrainian soldier probably knows somebody who's been killed and certainly knows somebody who's been wounded over the course of this fighting. And this must be having an effect on morale. There was another calculation, estimate that I saw, and I don't quite know where this figure comes from. And this comes from Asia Times. And that's a East Asian publication, obviously, but a fairly mainstream one as I understand it. Now, it says that the existing land force, in other words, the fighting force of the Ukrainian military, the existing one, numbers 198,000 men. Now, again, I don't know how this number is calculated. It's probably a reasonable one. I suspect this means combat soldiers. But bear in mind that, we got a report of guesstimate a couple of weeks ago from a site that, as I said, tries to track Ukrainian casualties, and it was coming up with this figure of 100,000, and its methodology seemed fairly strong, at least to me. Anyway, this put the total number of men and women, personnel in the Ukrainian military at around 370,000, down from a peak of around 500,000 at the start of the summer. Well, it seems to me that if we're looking at 350, 70,000, something like that, then it seems to me that a total of 200,000 of those being troops that could be deployed in combat, that seems to me a reasonable estimate. Well, if that is correct, then Ukraine, if that is correct, and if this figure of 100,000 is correct, and I have to qualify all of these things because we don't actually know. Ukraine doesn't give casualty figures. It doesn't report the exact size of its army, but these are estimates based from various people. If all of this is correct, then Ukraine has lost, killed in action, around a third of its combat soldiers. I say that because I'm assuming, and again it's another assumption, that those 100,000 reportedly killed in action are soldiers, are active duty soldiers, people who actually go into combat. So that is a very heavy rate of loss, combined with, as I said, all the problems with ammunition, combined with the fact that there apparently is now a growing tank shortage. This has been a recurring thing. Ukraine almost ran out of ammunition in the early part of the summer. It almost ran out of tanks. Very heavy supplies of ammunition and tanks from the United States and from Eastern Europe brought the Ukrainian military back up to strength and enabled it to carry out these offensives in the autumn, in Kharkiv, in Kherson. But it seems that all of that's been depleted again. All of this points to a very difficult situation for Ukraine on the battlefronts. Now, I talked about Ukrainian losses. I think it's necessary, in order to balance this, to talk about Russian losses. Now, Ukraine claims, I think, at the moment, around 80,000 Russian soldiers killed. Western commentators seem to have followed these Ukrainian estimates. I have to say straight away that I don't think there's any foundation to that figure. Now, the BBC, working with a website, an interesting website, by the way, called Medusa, based, I believe, in Latvia, which could be described in some ways as a kind of Russian dissident website. It's strongly hostile to the Putin government, and the rumors that it's funded by people like the exiled Russian oligarch Khodorkovsky. I can't confirm any of that, by the way, but that it is strongly anti-Putin is indisputable. But I would say also that some of its reporting has been interesting, and I would not wholly dismiss it. Anyway, they have, Medusa and the BBC, they have, using the same kind of methodology, by the way, as that other site that I spoke about, which calculated a few weeks ago, Ukrainian losses at around 100,000 killed in action. Well, this group, Medusa and the BBC, have been able to establish Russian losses, as they put it, of around 9,000 as of the middle of November. And Medusa, by the way, says that this proves that Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister's claimed that Russian losses were around 5,800 or 900 or whatever it was back. This was a flat-out lie. Well, straight away, I'm going to say a few things. I've looked at Medusa's analysis. I don't dispute its methodology. It's a sound methodology, but I don't think actually it contradicts what Shoigu said, because of course Shoigu gave his figure of 5,800 or 900 or whatever it was on the 21st of September, whereas Medusa is providing a figure for, I believe it was the 18th of November. In other words, 2 more months of fighting. So it's likely that there have been more Russian casualties in those 2 months. But I'm not convinced anyway that Medusa and the BBC and Shoigu are actually providing analogous figures. Now, I read Shoigu's comments at the time when they were made. It was absolutely clear to me when he did make those comments that he was referring to losses of the regular Russian military. Now, as far as I can judge, the BBC and Medusa are including not just the Russian regular military, but volunteer forces, especially forces from places like Caucasus. They talk about Dagestani losses as being particularly high, losses amongst Buryats being, this is a Siberian nation, being particularly high. A lot of these are known to have joined volunteer units. And of course, it's quite likely that this figure includes people who come from Chechnya and the Chechen military, probably the Rosgvardia organization, probably also the Wagner group, which, by the way, appears to have swollen in size. It was apparently 8,000 in total, at least in the conflict zone at the start of the fighting in Donbass back in April, May. Apparently it's now grown to something like 40,000. So I think that the figures are probably right, but I don't think that they prove that Shoigu was lying back in September. It's a different time frame, and probably the BBC and Medusa are looking at a larger pool of people than Shoigu is talking about. And of course, this doesn't include either the Donbass militia, though I am not sure that the BBC and Medusa are tracking casualties amongst the Donbass militia. They're probably only focusing on losses within Russia itself. So I can't talk about that, but I can't. And I mean, I think, by the way, they should make all of those numbers clear. They should make it clear what they're referring to. They don't. But for what it's worth, I think this figure of 9,000 is about right. Now, Medusa says that these numbers are incomplete, that they're talking about probably tens of thousands of losses. I don't see how they can say that. I don't see what the basis for extrapolating far larger numbers is, given the methodology that they themselves say they've applied. So, on that basis, it looks like Russian losses, regular military, Wagner group, volunteer forces, may be 10% of Ukrainian losses. And I think that, as I said, a lot of guesstimates here, but I think this feels about right. And this isn't, as we said before, a sustainable situation. 10,000, Russia, just to put the To put this thing brutally, Russia can afford to lose 10,000 men over a 9-month conflict. Ukraine can't. It can't afford to lose the number of men that Russia has lost over 9 months, over 9 months of fighting. Ukraine is losing that number of men every month. Shoigu, I think, at one point actually said that, it was Surovikin, I think, actually said that Ukraine's losses in October had been 12,000 killed in action. And that seems to be reasonably in correspondence with these numbers. And we see the kind of toll this is having on the Ukrainian forces. And we're now getting media commentaries about this. We have people like former military officers coming along, apparently appearing on US television channels. I haven't seen them on British channels, but apparently they are appearing on US television channels, also saying that Ukraine's losses are becoming a severe problem, that it may not be sustainable for Ukraine to conduct operations of this kind. There are growing numbers of admissions in the Western media about the ammunition, weapons shortage. Again, these are not appearing so much in the British media, but I understand that the United States media is full of these things. And all of this is happening even as Russian forces are being massively reinforced by these 300,000 reservists and 80,000 volunteers that are now joining the military. Now, to repeat again, not all of those 300,000 reservists are going to be combat troops. They're not all going to be assigned to combat units to fight on the front lines. Some of them will be, others are going to fill logistical roles, and they're going to be truck drivers and repair people and deal with ammunition matters and that kind of thing, and they're going to be working in the rear. But whatever, they are going to be a significant addition to the Russian military in this conflict area. And of course, we also continue to see more and more reports of large numbers of concentrations of Russian military hardware in Ukraine, even as Ukraine seems to be running out of weapon systems. The Russians seem to be increasing the number of weapon systems that they can deploy. And again, there's been some discussions about the scale of this. Perhaps the most interesting is from Colonel Macgregor, and he's given some figures. Now, I don't know, again, quite how Colonel Macgregor comes from these figures, but against that, I would say that he does seem to me to be someone who one takes very seriously, and he's been a former Pentagon official, and I'm assuming that he has knowledge, actual knowledge, and that these figures can be taken as being fairly reliable. And he's provided some extraordinary numbers. He says, and I'm quoting now from an article that he's written in the American Conservative. He says, the coming offensive phase of the conflict will provide a glimpse of the new Russian force that is emerging and its future capabilities. At this writing, 540,000 Russian combat forces are assembled in southern Ukraine, western Russia, and Belarus. The numbers continue to grow, but the numbers already include 1,000 rocket artillery systems, thousands of tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, 5,000 armored fighting vehicles, including at least 1,500 tanks, hundreds of manned fixed-wing attack aircraft, helicopters, and bombers. Now, I mean, this is a massive force 1,500 tanks, 1,000 rocket artillery systems. We're already seeing massive amount of Russian artillery fire again. There've been periods in the war when Ukraine has tried to match Russian artillery volumes. It's never really been able to do that, except, by the way, briefly at the start of the war in and around Kiev, when Ukraine apparently was able to deploy 2 artillery brigades to defend Kiev, and Ukraine actually at that point briefly had more artillery in that particular front than apparently the Russians did. But in Donbass, as far as I can see, the Russians have consistently and substantially outnumbered Ukraine in artillery systems, and the discrepancy is growing. It perhaps slightly reduced over the course of the summer as a result of supplies of Western artillery systems. They are running down. Now the Russians are increasing the volumes of their artillery, of their deployed artillery on the Ukrainian battlefronts, and that, they don't seem to have any shortage of ammunition. And of course, the discrepancies in artillery are increasing once more. And we're hearing about 1,500 tanks, 5,000 armored vehicles. And, as I say, I can't confirm these figures, but Colonel Macgregor is a serious man. I assume that, as I said, he's basing this on data which I haven't access to. He, through his position and his connections, almost certainly, undoubtedly does. And so we see this massive military discrepancy starting to build up. And of course, we come back to that topic of missile strikes. Now, yesterday I discussed the enormous supposed build-up that's going on at Engels Air Base, and the fact that the Russians seem to be preparing a massive missile strike against Ukraine. Well, that missile strike hasn't yet happened. Perhaps it's been timed for some particular event. That's quite likely, by the way. Perhaps it's all been prepared in coordination with the coming Russian offensive. Well, that may also be true. But all I will say is this. I've seen a comment that, around 18 strategic bombers are now being deployed. There's an estimate that if each of these bombers carries a cruise missile, the full load of cruise missiles which it can carry, then that would be 276 cruise missiles in total. That would be supplemented by cruise missiles launched by the Black Sea Fleet, and of course by land-based cruise missiles as well. Now, if that's anything like the kind of number that the Russians are preparing to launch in a single strike, then that is over 300 cruise missiles, probably substantially more than 300 cruise missiles in a single strike. Now, the highest number of cruise missiles that the Russians have apparently launched in a single strike up to now has been 90. So, if we're talking about 300 cruise missiles, well, and one shudders to think what that's going to do. And I would add, by the way, that it's now around, it's over a week since the last big Russian missile strike. Problems with the energy system continue right across Ukraine. The damage done has been tremendous. And as I've said before, the West, just as it's running out of ammunition to send to Ukraine, just as it's running out of artillery systems, France is talking about it's apparently confirmed that it's basically tapped out. It can't provide any more systems to Ukraine. Well, it's clear that there's also problems now in supplying surface-to-air missile systems, because the Pentagon has apparently ruled out again supplies of Patriot missiles to Ukraine. I think I'm right in saying that Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, has now confirmed that there will not be supplies of Patriot missiles to Ukraine. I'm guessing, by the way, that the US, the Pentagon, is worried more than anything else that if Patriot systems are sent to Ukraine, then it will burn through its stocks of those, just as it's burned through its stocks of all of the other systems that it's been sending to Ukraine. And given the critical importance of the Patriot system, the fact that the United States needs it means that it's simply not prepared to take the risk of supplying that to Ukraine in the kind of numbers that Ukraine appears to be demanding. And, we've been hearing a great deal about the NASAMS system. Again, Brian Beletic has discussed this at great length, the fact that only a small number of these systems have been provided. These are the surface-to-air missile systems that the United States has provided, that they are basically a attempt to convert the AMRAAM air-to-air missile into a surface-to-air missile, which, I'm not an expert in these things. Maybe that can work. Maybe that could be effective in some respects, but I wonder to what an extent it can succeed. But anyway, there aren't many of these systems. And I think that Brian Beletic said that, there's 6 being delivered altogether. 2 have been delivered already. Apparently there's a couple more on their way, but some of these have to be built. Anyway, I'm now reading reports that the United States is scouring the Middle East, trying to find Middle Eastern countries that will supply systems to cobble together, presumably, more NASAMS systems that can be sent to Ukraine. In other words, presumably, the United States is going to some of its Gulf allies and to some of it, maybe Egypt as well, and is trying to get them to return or sell or whatever some of the AMRAAM air-to-air missiles back to the United States so that the United States can put these together and pack them off to Ukraine. Now, I have to say, that does seem to me pretty desperate, but it's been reported in the media by reliable outlets, and I presume that this is all true. And by the way, there's been some rather interesting articles that have been appearing in various places about losses of Russian equipment, and these have been quite interesting. So firstly, going back to that story that the British media, the British Ministry of Defence got really excited about the fact that the Russians are using the old Kh-55 Soviet-era cruise missile as a decoy, that they've been replacing it with a sort of plug instead of the nuclear payload in order to act as a decoy. And the British Ministry of Defence tried to claim that that is a depleted, that proves somehow that Russian missile stocks are depleted. I was completely unable to follow the logic of that. Why would the Russians use presumably current missiles if they can take out of stock old Soviet missiles, which are presumably in the process of being disposed of? Why not use those old Soviet missiles rather than current production missiles if you want to create decoys? Well, it now seems that the photograph of what was supposed to be a decoy Kh-55, in other words, the photograph upon which this whole elaborate structure of this story was based, there's now increasing doubts that it even shows a Kh-55. It's been suggested that it shows a completely different piece of equipment. quite possibly Ukrainian. I'm not able to discuss this, but I just mentioned this. And I've also read a very interesting article about Russian helicopter losses. And bear in mind, the Russians have been using helicopters, helicopter gunships, the Ka-52 and the Mi-28, very heavily over the course of this conflict. And this against a combat environment in which Ukraine is saturated with man-pads, man-portable surface-to-air missiles, and of course other types of surface-to-air missiles, which presumably would pose a significant threat to these helicopters. Well, it seems that Russian helicopter losses have been rather light, which argues that most of these Western-supplied systems aren't proving terribly effective. I just mentioned all of this. So we have all of these problems of re-equipping Ukraine. We have all the indications, as I said, of a massive Russian build-up in terms of ground forces from Colonel Macgregor. We have indications of massive Russian missile strikes perhaps being prepared and on the way. I'm going to just add one word of caution about the Engels airbase story, these Russian bombers. Now, I don't know that these are connected events in any way, but a few days ago, the Russian and Chinese air forces conducted a major exercise involving strategic bombers in the Far East. And this exercise, for the first time, involved Russian bombers landing in China, in Chinese bases, and Chinese bombers landing in Russia. And I do wonder, there's just a suggestion that maybe some of this activity we've been seeing in Engels is in some way connected with this exercise. I say that because, as I understand it, Engels is the major base of Russia's strategic bomber force. But more probably, it is connected with a major strike against Ukraine. Anyway, all of this going on, growing military power on the one side, a depleted Ukrainian force on the other, Ukraine going through a major energy crisis. There's more reports now about Ukrainian officials trying to urge people to leave the cities. I think that they should go much further than that. I've discussed that in previous videos. All of this pointing to an extremely difficult situation. And I wonder whether all of this explains a sudden flurry of activity on the part of Western leaders. Now, Emmanuel Macron has just been to the United States. He's met Joe Biden there. He's apparently complained about cost of LNG that's been supplied to Europe by the United States. He's also complained about the the green subsidy bill, which is supposedly attracting European industries to the United States. My impression, by the way, from their joint press conference is that they didn't get very much. Macron didn't get very much from Biden on either of these issues. I don't think Biden is in a position to make any concessions to Macron on these sort of issues. But anyway, interestingly enough, Biden, though he hedged it with all kinds of qualifications, I mean, he made it seem that basically the Russians had to capitulate. Anyway, for the first time, he seemed to be prepared to at least discuss the possibility of him having some kind of discussion with Putin, a one-to-one discussion with Putin about looking for some kind of end to the Ukrainian war. Now, all of this comes after the Russian disclosures that despite American denials, Narishkin, the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, and William Burns, the director of the CIA, when they met in Ankara, despite American denials, Burns and Narishkin did in fact discuss the situation in Ukraine. It does make me wonder whether some people maybe are getting worried that over the next few weeks, over the next few months, they're looking at some kind of a military debacle. They may be looking at some kind of a military debacle in Ukraine. And one Western leader has actually picked up the telephone and spoken to Vladimir Putin. And that leader was Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany. Having said that, if the West is coming to the Russians, expecting the Russians to back down or compromise in any way, well, the Russian readout of Putin's discussions with Scholz gives short shrift to that idea. And I'm going to read the readout. Now, I should stress this is not yet the official Kremlin's translation. It's a sort of, that hasn't yet appeared, but it is a translation from taken from the actual Russian text. And I'm going to read it out. What it says is the following. And this is from Putin, and the conversation, by the way, seems to have taken place today. Telephone conversation today, Friday the 2nd of December. Telephone conversation with Federal Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, at the initiative of the German side. That's the first word, the first words in the Russian readout. Now, I've explained many times in the past that when a readout identifies which side has solicited the call, that is done with a purpose. The Russians are signaling that they were not asking the Germans for this conversation. The Germans were asking them for this conversation. The initiative came from Germany. In other words, it is the Germans who are begging, who are in effect coming as the party asking for something to the Russians. It's the Russians who are in the stronger position over this course of this call. And to repeat again, at the initiative of the German side, Vladimir Putin had a telephone conversation with Federal Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Olaf Scholz. And then it gets increasingly brutal. Various aspects of the situation around Ukraine were discussed. Vladimir Putin once again, note the once again, in other words, he's repeating himself, explained in detail the fundamental Russian approaches to conducting a special operation, military operation. Attention is drawn to the destructive line of Western states, including Germany, pumping up the Kiev regime with weapons, training the Ukrainian military. All this, as well as comprehensive political and financial support for Ukraine, leads to the fact that Kiev completely rejects the idea of any negotiations. In addition, this stimulates radical Ukrainian nationalists to commit more and more bloody crimes against the civilian population. Let me stress, this is the Russian readout. This is what the Russians say Putin said to Scholz. The president of Russia called on the German side to reconsider its approaches in the context of the Ukrainian events. In other words, the blame in Ukraine for all that's going on there lies on Ukraine and on the West. Western policy has been destructive. It has encouraged Ukraine to continue the war, and it has encouraged radical Ukrainian nationalists, as Putin calls them, to commit more crimes against the civilian population. That, I stress, is what Putin said, what Putin is reported to have said to Scholz. Now, the next paragraph is even more interesting, because we know from the German version of this call that Scholz complained to Putin about the Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy system. And the Russian readout of the call between Putin and Scholz has Putin saying this: "It was noted that the Russian armed forces had long refrained from targeted missile strikes against certain targets on the territory of Ukraine, but now such measures have become a forced and inevitable response to Kiev's provocative attacks against Russian civilian infrastructure, including the Kiev-Crimean Bridge and energy facilities." In other words, the Russians don't apologize for their missile strikes on the energy system, and those strikes will continue. In the same row, in the same way, is the terrorist attack. Again, this is again Putin speaking to Scholz against the Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines, the circumstances of which require a transparent investigation with the participation of Russian specialized structures. And then, of course, we have a further paragraph about the grain situation, the issues of implementation of the Istanbul package agreements of July 22 on the export of Ukrainian grain from the Black Sea ports, and the unblocking of the export of food and fertilizer from Russia were also touched on. The need for a conscientious, integrated implementation of the grain deal was emphasized, which implies the removal of all barriers for Russian supplies. So, Scholz telephoned Putin, found Putin in an uncompromising mood. And why should Putin compromise? As far as he's concerned, his position in Ukraine is becoming stronger. His military there is strengthening. The energy attacks on Ukraine are having an effect. The West is running out of options. It can't send ammunition. It's struggling to send more weapon systems. It's not really in a position to supply Ukraine with surface-to-air missiles. Supplies to Ukraine of technology, of machines to replace the damage to the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, is all but impossible. Why should Putin compromise at this time? And, of course, more missile strikes are coming. Probably more offensives, Russian offensives, are coming as well. And of course, the situation in Bakhmut is becoming critical, and we may be seeing soon a critical crisis for the Ukrainians around Avdiivka near Donetsk as well. Well, where is all this going? The Western powers, the EU, is still quarreling, as I'm talking, about the Russian oil price cap idea. And there's now seems to be a growing consensus, growing admission, even amongst the Europeans, that this was all a horrible mistake and that they would have been far better off never going down this road. So there's out of options there. But maybe, just possibly, there could be some kind of discussion that might lead to some kind of an agreement for a resolution of the Ukrainian crisis. What might that be? Well, John Helmer, again, one of the most insightful commentators, one of the best informed commentators about Russian thinking, has recently written an extremely interesting article about the possibility of a North Korea, South Korea type division of Ukraine. And he's actually provided a map of how this might look, with a Russian-controlled zone, which, as far as I can see, would include Odessa, by the way, a kind of demilitarized area in between, and then a sort of rump Ukraine, still under some kind of Western supervision. Beyond that, and there are quotes, I should say these are anonymous quotes, but Helmer does have his sources from various people who, military people that Helmer has consulted, in which they talk about the logic, both for the Russians and to some extent for the West, in agreeing to such a partition of Ukraine. And for all I know, that is still the plan in Moscow. It's it's the kind of thing which I can imagine the Kremlin and perhaps the General Staff agreeing to. Essentially, east and southern Ukraine, the major industrial and agricultural areas of Ukraine would become part of Russia, and Ukraine, minus a further demilitarized zone like the one separating North and South Korea, would be left with Western Ukraine, some of the agricultural regions in the center. I say agricultural regions, though, as I understand it, they're mainly pasture, not black earth, rich arable land, and of course Kiev itself, that would presumably be left under Ukrainian control. And that would be consistent, by the way, with something that the Russians have said today in response to Biden's talk about the possibility of him speaking with Putin. The Russians have said, well, the major obstacle between preventing that happening is that the United States is still unable to recognize, is still refusing to recognize the four regions, Kherson, Zaporozhye, the two Donbass republics, as well as Crimea, as part of Russia, and that is standing in the way of discussions. And the Russians talk like that, that might imply that they are still thinking, they're still prepared to discuss partition arrangements for Ukraine along those kind of lines. My own view about this is that there might still be a window to agree to this. But my own feeling is that the time for that is starting to ebb away. Now, Helmer concedes that there is a line of thinking in Moscow, of some people in Moscow, who are saying that the only real resolution to this problem is for the full occupation by the Russians of every part of Ukraine, including those parts of Ukraine, Western Ukraine, which were formerly parts of Romania, Hungary, and Poland. Not even a partition involving those countries. So Helmer accepts that there is a line of thought in Moscow that does say this. I'm going to say this. I don't know how far the Russian offensive, if it comes, will go. Helmer says that the feeling in Russia is that this is going to be a grinding campaign. It's general patience rather than general winter that is the sort of operative word. And I agree. I've discussed why I don't think the Russians are going to move towards big arrow offensives, or at least that's not their plan at the moment. But just consider the possibility. Let's say that the Russians do carry out an offensive, that they clear Donbass, that they break Ukrainian defenses in Donbass, that they capture Bakhmut, Vuhledar, that they clear all the area around Donetsk, that Slavyansk and Kramatorsk fall under their control, and that they advance all the way to the east bank of the Dnieper, bringing them opposite Dnipro, and that within striking range of places like Poltava and Kremenchuk, and all of those places as well. And let's also assume that Ukraine loses cities like Zaporozhye and perhaps finds itself under severe pressure in Kharkiv. And let's make a further assumption, which I think is a very realistic assumption, which is that at some point the Russians also take steps to destroy the Dnieper bridges. Given the losses Ukraine has already suffered, and given the enormous losses that would suffer, its military would suffer over and above those losses, if the situation I have outlined is going to come true, then I can't help but think that at that point, Ukraine would be in existential crisis. That the entire Ukrainian state at that point would be on the brink of collapse. In which case, would it really be logical for the Russians to choose to stop at the Dnieper? Maybe, but I wonder whether the Russians might feel that what is left beyond the Dnieper might be so chaotic that it might make more sense for them to move forward and to occupy all the rest and to try whatever process of pacification that they can carry out. Now, I don't want to speculate too far. I don't know what the Russians are thinking. Perhaps they are thinking in the way that Helmer says. Maybe this kind of partition with a demilitarized zone is Russia's preferred option. And as I said, Russian comments, statements at the moment do seem to correspond with that. But the time window to achieve that might not be very big. Well, will Scholz, Macron, Biden finally do what they must do and start these negotiations? I've noticed one report, by the way, again in a Western media outlet, saying that rather than provide more weapon systems to Ukraine, which the West is going to struggle to do, the West is going to try and help Ukraine by training more Ukrainian soldiers. Training them to what purpose? To send them into battle without weapons, sufficient weapons? That seems to me a cynical and cruel thing to do, if that is the plan. Surely the better thing to do is to start those negotiations now. To tell Zelensky and his officials that this has gone as far as it can. That Western economies are suffering, that the Western industrial complex is not geared for supporting Ukraine through the kind of industrialized war it now finds itself in, that the West cannot continue to provide Ukraine with the unlimited support that it perhaps promised back in the summer, and that what for Ukraine will be a difficult compromise involving major concessions now has to be made. That seems to me, I've said this so often, that seems to me the only logical way forward. Perhaps Biden and Macron talked around this idea. Perhaps Scholz, in calling Putin, was exploring these possibilities. Scholz has made other statements, by the way, other public statements, in which he seems to have floated the idea that once the Ukraine war ends, and he's still talking apparently of the Russians pulling out of Ukraine entirely, that there will be some kind of attempt to reintegrate Russia into the European system. If he thinks that's something that can persuade the Russians to change their policies in Ukraine, well, I think he's frankly delusional. But maybe it shows that he is also trying to find some kind of off-ramp, some kind of way out. Well, if that's the case, his conversation with Putin should have settled any doubts that he might have. The Russians remain in an implacable mood. Russian public opinion has hardened in support of the war. It's time that the Western powers started to be more realistic, because, of course, if General Patience or General Winter, or perhaps both together, come into play, if General Surovikin deploys the sledgehammer that I was discussing yesterday, as I'm sure he will, well, it may be that, as I said, instead of negotiations, we could find a situation where the Russians find that they not only dictate terms, but that those terms might be even harsher and more difficult for the West than the kind of partition plan that Helmer is talking about and saying that the Russians are considering. Well, that's me for today. That's over an hour. So I think this is a good point to stop, and I shouldn't anyway go on further than this. We'll see what happens over the next couple of days. I will, of course, continue to do my updates, and in the meantime, it remains for me to wish you a good day, to remind you that you can find all our videos on our other platforms, locals, where we have a thriving community and where you can participate in my Wednesday live streams, on Rumble, on ODYSEE, on BitChute, on Rockfin, and on Telegram. You can also find us on, you can also support our work rather via Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop and buying the amazing merchandise that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hats, all of those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button, to check your subscription to this channel. And as I said, more from me soon, and have a very good day. Until then.